Twig 4. With my birthday came another change. I started walking on my own again. I'd been reasonably able to before the attack, enough to manage it if I really tried, though I'd been fairly wobbly. But being hospitalized for weeks and sick for months had swept most of my progress on that front away. I'd lost strength, stamina, body fat and muscle, though it might have been odd to think of any of those things in regards to a baby. But healing bodies needed something to feed on, and often they fed on themselves. I'd been doing my best to eat enough to try to make up for that, but it was a struggle with my condition and with as many mouths as I had to feed, and it only went so far when I spent most of the day asleep. Being able to move around, even just a bit more effectively though, it meant a lot to me, as restricted on that front as I'd been. It meant I wasn't entirely reliant on others for most things, which was a relief, especially when it came to the more humiliating parts of being a baby, and it meant that in an emergency, I'd be able to do more than just wait for death. How much more remained to be seen, but it was something. I was still at the point where I'd rather walk down the walls besides a flight of stairs than take them the hard way, just like my preference was still to use chakra to make things stick to my hands, rather than embarrass myself by dropping my food and sippy cups all over the place. But I could now go up and down the stairs. Although, admittedly, not unsupervised. My mother and grandfather were somewhat hyper-vigilant about keeping track of where I was now that I could walk, even more so than when I was younger, and they'd installed some kind of baby cam or motion detector around the stairs that I decided to simply accept the wisdom of. But it still meant a degree of independence, at least. They'd show up and then watch me try the stairs, or open a cabinet, or observe from the porch while I played in the yard. But I could do those things now, and it was enough of a relief that it felt like a knot of tension untying. I like to think I bore it with grace, but there were parts of being a baby that were really stressing, having previously been more or less an adult. Talking wouldn't seem as odd now either, as long as I kept responses short. I still didn't really like the sound of my voice as a baby, but what works works. I could say something while other people were around without having to jump through hoops if I chose. In some ways, being able to move around outside without being carried or something was the biggest gain from that, because on the subject of stress, there was something I'd been putting off, letting out my mutated swarm for anything but urgent specific tasks. I was wary of what might happen if I did, honestly. Given my health, if I released my bugs and then suddenly passed out, I wasn't sure what would happen before I woke up. As a result, I'd spent the last 3 months or so feeding and tending to them almost entirely inside my own body. I wanted to let them out, at least for a little while, and have some peace inside my body, if not inside my mind. I sent them out into the forest beside our new compound, and verified no humans were around before putting them on autopilot. Partially just to see if I could trust them on autopilot, and partially just so I didn't have to think about them for a while. While I was at it, I checked on my other swarms with a brush of my attention, confirming they were all still fine, and then put them on autopilot too. Then, at last, I turned my attention inwards. Right now, the only things inside my body were my Rinkaiju, and with my range extended to full, I couldn't sense or control them except in the barest sense, which was part of what I wanted to test. Due to the state of my swarms, plural, I'd been careful, maybe even overly so, about handling chakra. I tested that I still could, proven I could still gather it and walk up walls, at least while shrinking my range down to just my body and controlling all of them. But with both a ravenous nanoswarm plague and an army of mutant zombie bugs, I've been wary about practicing too much without maintaining tight control. That wasn't unusual in my clan, seemingly, as a number of our hosted species normally required careful chakra control and maintenance, and trying to do too much at once could be risky for the inexperienced. But if there were any issues, they were something I'd have to learn to live with. And the first description of Earth Nature Chakra had been interesting. If the secret to using Earth Release was to separate your chakra into different pieces and then reassemble them into a different form, that was something I'd already found myself doing with my chakra. On a macroscopic scale, I'd made interconnected hexagonal plates, but on a microscopic scale, I'd already considered how it resembled something else. Hexagon-shaped bonds, like carbon nanotubes or sheets of graphite. What was that if not Earth release? I'd go so far as to bet that the reason breaking apart and putting together chakra was the secret behind it was that most Earth release focused on changing and controlling the structure of matter. Even on the scale I'd been working at, I'd used hexagons for their durability and stability. Could I take that further? I hadn't noticed any difference on my scale, but I hadn't done anything on my scale, except in pieces. If I tried... Slowly, I began to gather my chakra, molding it in my abdomen. I took my time, focusing on the feeling of it. I'd spent months now learning everything about my own biology, how chakra flowed through it, and, with the Rinkaiju's help, how to manipulate it on a very tiny level. Now I try to do that without any training wheels. Technically speaking, the technique I'd named Sendan Kendantsuba was just an application of my Higanbana, making use of my massively shrunken range to help me use it at a very tiny level, making microscopic tubes to contain and guide the tiniest members of my swarm. But if I tried to use it in a different way... My body began to sting as the amount of chakra I gathered continued to increase, my Rinkaichu growing agitated at the foreign sensation. But the funny thing was, as the amount of chakra I gathered grew, the sensation first sharpened, and then began to grow duller and duller, until it was just pins and needles. Taura! My grandfather's voice called from the porch. I opened my eyes and looked at him, seeing my mother standing beside him, looking worried behind the hand he'd raised to hold her back. Leave it be. I looked down at myself and saw that my skin was turning gold, only for my agitated Rinkaichu to rise to the surface in growing patches of red. Carefully, I stopped, withdrawing my chakra to a level more soothing for my swarm, even as I checked on my scattered Shinshu that were out feeding. Several birds and squirrels had been reduced to gnawed bones, but the omnivorous swarm had also taken to sucking sap from trees and eating what foliage they could find. It had been a couple hours, maybe. Long enough. I called them back, and once they were safely inside me, shrunk my range to make sure that the Rinkaichu were docile. Once the color faded from my skin, my grandfather turned back to the book he was reading, like nothing had happened, and my mother came over and sat down beside me. Aren't you cold, Taura? She asked, and I shook my head. I was wearing baby winter gear, and it was a relatively warm day. She gave me a wooden block as a treat, and I took it with just a touch of embarrassment, chewing on it. I felt better than I normally did, maybe because my swarm had gotten to feed, and I only coughed up one mask that day, later that evening. However, one thing did happen, though I wasn't entirely sure how I felt about it. About an hour after my mother took me inside, I felt an itch in my throat and began coughing quietly. After a couple choked heaves, I threw up a handful of my Shinshu, the beetles swarming over my tiny hands before flying towards the mask that slightly preceded them. They latched onto the back of it, slowly forming a facsimile of a person's head out of their clawing bodies, even as the mask hung in the air, before I suppressed them, before my mother came over from where she was feeding Shino, checking on me. I decided not to think about or deal with that for the time being. Soon spring arrived, and with it my swarms abruptly swelled. I'd put a lot of time and effort into breeding my more valuable bugs, trying to restore their populations, and careful selection had ensured that the new generations were strong and healthy. My spiders especially were back in force. The new generation of Yora had hatched near the start of spring, meaning I was back in business. Already I had enough spiders that a simple storehouse wasn't enough. My grandfather had to construct a large, if mostly empty, castle behind the compound. The now aforementioned spiderweb castle. The rest of my swarms were catching up more slowly, but were also growing well. In particular, thanks to the food supplied to them over the winter, my beehives had established themselves enough that they were able to gather food normally come the spring. By next year, they'd have built up enough honey that we could harvest from them again. But thanks to the influx of new weavers, I finished preparing the first batch of new clothes with time to spare, giving me extra time to mull over possibilities and designs. Soon, the compound saw a steady line of shinobi coming back from missions and trickling in for measurements with varying degrees of negative enthusiasm. My grandfather matched them by remaining grumpy about the whole process, but his mood improved quickly. "It'll be done in 2 weeks," he said as a young man with a large scar across his face walked through the door, not looking up from his book. "What about my measurements?" the young man said. "Took them while you were online, kid. You just didn't notice," my grandfather drawled. The young man frowned, seeming aggrieved, but his expression shifted slightly as I drew a few bugs away from his clothes. I didn't want my grandfather to have to get up to measure every shinobi in Konoha when I could just do it before they came in, and I figured if anyone did notice the bugs, well, we were the Aburame clan. Would they be surprised? Word spread, and that actually seemed to improve the perception of the task among the somewhat ordinary shinobi, as they began to see it as a challenge. It was a bit annoying that they kept searching for and trying to swat away my bugs, but I wasn't using any useful ones for this, and I began to take measurements while they were farther and farther away instead. Some of them got creative, which was interesting. One unsealed a spare change of clothes and switched into it right before dashing inside, another using a transformation technique before getting in line, and a third taking a somewhat confusing route for trying to avoid bugs by burrowing underground until he reached the doorstep. But I also got better at foiling their attempts, primarily by just using my swarms to take measurements hours or even days in advance, sending my bugs sometimes far afield. Getting back to making costumes also meant getting back to practicing my weaving. I'd made enough costumes for the Protectorate that I'd probably never forget the feeling, but there was still a familiarity to it that I hadn't realized I'd been missing. The sensation of having hundreds of thousands of spiders constantly weaving silk, rotating in shifts to rest and feed, and then returning to tasks where others had left off was something I'd lived with for most of 2 years. And it was as familiar of a habit as having swarms investigating my surroundings. Returning to that was almost meditative, especially as it helped fill the long moments where being a baby didn't give my body much to do. And practice made perfect. I thought, if that was true, making thousands of suits for the Protectorate would have gotten me there already. But with them, I'd mostly focused on making undersuits, replacing cloth portions of armor, and doing what I could, which had been limited to what my bugs could naturally handle. Designing military equipment to keep people alive in the field was a notable shift, and the addition of chakra was an enormous one. And before long, I came to what felt like a realization. It was easier to channel chakra into something you've trained extensively, not just because of the training itself, but because of the focus of that training, the place that practice has in the body and mind, the physical and spiritual portions of chakra. Or at least, that's what it felt like to me, as slowly, the flow of my chakra began to mold the silk into something more, without me even trying to do so. I was considering how best to incorporate what I'd learned into the next batch of clothes I was making, before my grandfather stopped me. "Don't," he advised as soon as I told him what I was up to, and I looked up at him. "I'm not just saying that because you should be paid appropriately for your time, skill, and labor. Although to be clear, you absolutely should, and if anyone wants something better from you, they should start by paying for it. This is something I have to say both for your and the clan's sake. It's one thing if it's a personal project or a commission, but right now you're making uniforms, which means they should be uniform. I know it might sound cruel, might even be cruel, but in a situation where a group of Konoha shinobi gets ambushed and all of them get hit by the same jutsu, either they should all live or they should all die. We don't want one shinobi to die because he was wearing the third set of armor you made and another to get badly injured but survive because he had the 300th, and one to survive unscathed because he wore the 3000th. That's what standardization means. And if you put variable strength products into field use, you're just going to have problems and regrets later, and so might the entire clan, depending on who ends up wearing the faulty equipment. If you want them to all live, then practice and take what you learned from this experience and make a second line of armor after you finish this one. It would be a lie to say I was completely happy about that, but I understood Grandfather's point, and since I was a baby right now, he and the clan would be held liable for the consequences of anything I did. I didn't want anyone to get hurt if I could help it, and wanted as few people as possible to get hurt as possible. But I also didn't want the clan's reputation to be hurt. I decided to power through the current batch of suits, get everyone in the village at least decently protected, and return to the topic later. And to my grandfather's point, the more time I spent weaving again, the more I learned about the process. Still, I wanted to know I was doing everything I possibly could. That night, after everyone was asleep, I had my bugs ferry one of my Yoro to me, laying it gently upon my hand. Closing my eyes, slowly, carefully, I let my Rinkaichu infect it. Let's start from the very first step, I thought as I began to examine it. By the start of summer, the first batch of my suits were in the field, and word was spreading again, sometimes in odd ways. You saved my life again, Aburami-sama. A man I didn't recognize said, coming by the house one morning. Someone from the Kyuubi attack, I assumed. My grandfather accepted the praise somewhat gruffly, but gave the man a respectful nod and exchanged pleasantries for a while, before walking him to the edge of the property, presumably to help build relations. What surprised me, though, was it soon became a recurring thing, with people stopping by the compound periodically. I wasn't used to it. I'd gotten thanks for making suits now and then, but mostly from my friends. I provided silk to most of the protectorate, but no one had really acted like this. Probably because I'd already been one of the most famous supervillains in the country by then, and had recently killed Alexandria. But the idea of being stopped on the street for people to thank me, us, for services rendered was a touch foreign to me. It was a reminder that for all its similarities, Konoha had its differences from most of the parahuman organizations I remembered. A surprisingly basic one being that they all lived in the same village, and were broadly speaking, neighbors. Even coming to terms with that though, I was surprised the first time someone showed up in silk armor that had recently been reduced to rags, the entire thing still slightly smoking. "I'll take 3 more, please," the teenager from the Hokage's test, the one with the bowl cut, said, sounding rather cheerful, all things considered. "Also, would it be possible to get them in green, perhaps, Aburami-san?" My grandfather just grunted and pointed to the sign for the prices of special requests, which the teenager glanced at for about 5 seconds before writing a check and leaving, humming a happy tune. He met up with the white-haired boy who had annihilated my test dummy, who was standing outside the compound, looking annoyed. After my spider silk was proven in the field, requests like this had become more and more common, and grumpy as it sometimes made my grandfather to wake up and interact with people all day, quantity had a quality of its own. Even selling it for the low price of a C-rank mission, I was selling enough that the Aburami-class coffers were swelling. Although, apparently, that came with its own issues. "The other elders keep giving me looks," Grandfather bemoaned. Mother apparently understood whatever he was complaining about and gave him a sympathetic look. "Keep going on about how we should project our power and wealth to the other villages, but also how we need to be elegant and refined without looking ostentatious. Who the hell cares? They really want us to buy a house in the capital like the Hyuga did, just so we can never ever go there. Do I look like I'm made of money?" We basically were now, I thought, but didn't say. My grandfather was careful with his money. I'd already told him to just use the money I'd brought in for whatever the clan needed, but the idea of taking his granddaughter's money just to show off to the other clans or villages seemed abhorrent to him. I was apathetic towards the money, which I guess made me the weird one here. But somehow, money had never seemed to keep people from tearing down my world. I'd made more money in my previous life than I'd made as of now, $15 to $20 million during my time with the Undersiders, and I'd made that money quicker too. But where had it gotten me? $20 million hadn't stopped the world from ending, hadn't even really kept the people around me safe. But grandfather had come from the other side of things, the end of the warring era, where poverty had children dying in the streets or else killing to survive. Still, what was the point of making this money if not to take care of my family? I was making a daimyo's ransom, enough money to last my family for generations, and all it was really costing me was a couple years of work, and even then, I was working from home. And above all that, I was effectively making us a household name in the village. I would have been happy with my family using that money for whatever they preferred. "Have you given it any thought?" my grandfather asked then, changing the topic as he shifted his gaze to me. I knew what he meant and shook my head, mostly because I didn't really care. But someone had apparently asked to name our new business. If you asked me, Aburami Silk would have been fine, and if I was pressed beyond that, I was probably just going to end up calling it something generic like Shinobi wear. As is, I was still scheduling out my growing backlog of requests, and considering how I was going to handle them over the winter, in terms of keeping my spiders well fed. And so I was mostly indifferent to the patent that was going to go to the Hokage's office, and then be used in information warfare as it was then fed to the more easily monitored Fire Country office. My grandfather apparently preferred the pun he'd picked before, Kenshi, while my mother liked the name Orihime for Weaver Girl. I left them to decide it between themselves. More interestingly though, some packages had arrived for us. I hadn't stopped my experiments with lag dye, although they hadn't borne much fruit yet either, in the same way that having millions of spider hours weaving let me improve the final product, having more than a night spent making lac let me incorporate more chakra into the dye, but almost all of it was still drained or burnt out in the dyeing process. The packages we received in the fall contained several bricks of chakra metal dust though, and I had hoped that it would change things. I found that if I channeled my chakra into it normally, it formed a vague blob, but if I transformed it into Earth Nature chakra, it became distinct and solid. If I did that with a pile of dust, I could give it a kind of structure, using my chakra as connecting points in the dust and, to be honest, a part of me wanted to keep it just as a toy to play with. I mean, a training tool. But it might be possible with this. I'd have to test it though. A mordant allowed a chemical reaction to occur between the dye and the fabric, while the saddening process allowed the iron to bond to the dye. If I controlled the iron while I did that, and the iron retained its properties, then maybe... By my second birthday, my beehives had recovered enough for us to begin harvesting honey again, which led to a somewhat curious birthday party. I hadn't had anything in particular in mind for my second birthday, so for the most part my family had gotten me clothes and toys, which were both fine. However, my grandfather had proposed something interesting. "Let's make some honey wine," my grandfather said, perhaps overestimating how much I'd be helping with the process as a 2-year-old, and possibly also what was appropriate for a 2-year-old. He rolled his eyes when he saw my look. "We'll open them when you're older, and if they're good, we'll enjoy it, and if they aren't, we'll laugh." It was fun. I'd never made mead before, and as far as I'm aware, neither had he. But we gave it a try. By which I mean he gave it a try, consulting an old-looking book he'd picked up somewhere, and I sat in a booster seat, supervising. But it was a very pleasant, harmless way to spend my birthday, and I liked it. In the end, he prepared 5 demijohns, or something like them, using different herbs, fruits and spices for each. I was pretty sure the first 2 were going to be at best unpleasant to drink from some mistakes made in the process. But the 3rd, 4th and 5th seemed alright. If nothing else, it'd make an interesting birthday tradition. My father had been caught up on a mission and couldn't make it, sadly. But after I confirmed my interest, my mother took me to see a famous mask maker, at least according to his signpost. A survivor from Uzashio's fall, although my grandfather mumbled darkly when he saw that, so it might not have been entirely true. It had apparently been pretty expensive to convince him to allow outsiders to watch his process, but my mother apparently convinced him by showing him her family's mask. It was interesting, in the way watching someone be good at their craft was interesting. Even if he might have been a fake, he was apparently a convincing fake, and seemed to know a fair bit about the process. The most important thing is to select the right wood, the mask maker said. Uzasio masks all use hinoki, cypress trees native to the lands of frost and certain parts of the land of lightning, which has caused some trouble in the past. But the cold weather causes them to grow very slowly and produces beautiful rings. For a true no mask, you'll want to use trees that are at least 200 years old. Held in my mother's arms, I watched as he went through the show of carefully selecting wood that he'd already selected from his storage. And I could feel something in the wood blocks he'd selected, practically calling out to me and making me hungry. These hinoki, it was just a guess, but something about the process of growing in so harsh a climate and growing so slowly seemed to make them resonate with the yang chakra. Aside from that, he walked us through the process of carefully sawing, carving and painting the masks, as well as lacquering the backs. But I already felt like I'd found something here, even if I wasn't sure what I was going to do with that information yet. Producing my own masks was still a problem for me, but had just become part of my routine. Most days I just made one, and I'd gotten used to restraining them without letting my bugs get close enough to start merging with them. I was still waiting for the right time to revisit whatever that was about, and would probably continue to until I was confident I could obliterate whatever might come of it. Your grandfather keeps trying to give them gross names, like Nukubi and Tsurube Otoshi, Mother said with a sniff as we walked by the mask maker's wares, a series of shells with what I assumed were poetically named masks. But the names fit, don't they? Grandfather drawled, looking bored. I guess watching a traditional mask maker work was only so interesting for someone who had an alarm set to go restrain and dispose of flying, cackling masks on the regular. What would you call them? Oshi Tsubaki, Mother answered immediately, and my grandfather gave a wry smile. Well, ain't that so much better, he said. Oshi Tsubaki, falling camellia. Apparently camellia were famous for the heads of their flowers falling off all at once, and it was likened to decapitation, which was why it was bad luck to gift them. I thought naming it for the decapitation flower probably also counted as disturbing imagery, but what do I know? I'm just a baby. Other than that, my second birthday passed uneventfully, though it led the way into another busy year. By spring, my spider population had grown into the millions, swelling to the point that I had to be a little careful about maintaining them, applying a similar level of care to the breeding of their prey, and their prey's prey as well. I finished supplying Kona with new uniforms ahead of schedule, making all the suits requested by mid-year, and after that, things quieted down significantly, but for occasional requests for replacements and repairs. In time, I figured that would change, as younger genin grew up and new Shinobi entered the workforce, but for a while, things were quiet. I didn't trust it. I kept working on my own, preparing, waiting for something to go wrong. For my third birthday, and with my family's permission and assistance, I bought several blocks of hinoki wood from an apparently famous part of the Land of Frost, and stored them carefully until I knew what to do with them. I thought about buying some chakra-absorbing dust too, but decided to wait. Money wasn't an issue, but for the time being it was easy enough to use the dust we already had. If and when I finished hammering out the method to use it properly, I might buy some for myself to keep it on me, but for now there wasn't much need. I'd made some progress on that front, but also run into several issues. Using my bugs as a reference point made maintaining chakra structures in the air easy enough, but maintaining it underwater was proving more difficult because it meant setting aside most of my eyes. For the time being, I was trying to overcome that myself, as a test of my own capabilities and chakra control, but I'd asked my father for some shrimps and crabs for my third birthday. Even a small number, raised properly, could help me control chakra underwater, and if that wasn't enough, I'd probably need to look into how to make water-natured chakra. But I was a bit frustrated that I was having difficulties. Although it felt like slow going, several years of training had left me pretty confident in my chakra control, at least within my body. Perhaps it was the nature of my own chakra working against me though. I could pretty easily extend my chakra through solid points of connection, as long as the gaps between them weren't too large. But it was hard for me to extend my chakra through open air or water. Maybe the issue was that I was aspected towards Earth, or else so connected to the idea of swarms. Or maybe that was something that fell more in line with wind and water chakra. Really, though, I wanted to move on to better things and start training already, even if I knew my body was still young. But I told myself this was a kind of conditioning, like preparing the body before learning martial arts, and that all this chakra control practice would come in handy when I moved on to other things. I hoped that was true. In the meantime, I followed my grandfather's advice and kept practicing my silk on my own time, and after 2 years of practice, review and careful consideration, I thought I was ready to start on the next batch of silk. I brought it up with my grandfather near the start of summer of my 3rd year, and he passed it on to the Hokage in the middle of fall. The Hokage expressed interest, as did several others that were notified of the possibility, but due to scheduling it was pushed back to the end of the year. Somehow though, despite everything and how hard it was to believe, nothing bad had happened. I only caught word of how missions were going when Shinobi came back to the village, but things seemed hopeful, despite the tragedies that had occurred. By all accounts, things were going well. Casualty rates were at an all-time low, and mission completion rates were higher than anyone could have expected, considering Konoha's losses in and after the war. I wish I had records of how effective my silk had actually been in the field, beyond the people who occasionally came by the shop. If I'd been grown up, I could test it myself, but I was still building defensive measures against threats I'd never seen before. But things seemed to be going well. I was cautiously optimistic for once, as the good news kept coming. Kumo Gakure had sent an ambassador to negotiate a peace with Konoha, finally spelling an end to a long, long war.